This webinar is all about successfully establishing the oilseed crop. The oilseed crop has gone through many highs and lows, and with highs in the form of area up to 700,000 hectares to the lows of 300,000 hectares over the last decade. Also in terms of highs, then by way of price, with today's budget being set at £725 a tonne versus £340 a tonne in 2020. And also, of course, the highs of yield, where we've heard crops of 7 tonnes a hectare versus those of 1 tonne a hectare. Well, today's webinar is very much with some of those thoughts in mind, and we've titled it Fail to Plan or Plan to Fail, in that there has never been sort of more appropriate use of those words. So we really do want to plan for success. Today, I'm joined by Natalie Wood, who's the Agronomy Operations Manager for Yara, and Liam Wilkinson, Technical Specialist with the major seed breeder, Limagrain. Liam will cover some of the key focus areas for varietal selection, and when that comes to establishment and what things to be considering. And then Natalie will follow on with sort of best practice advice for crop nutrition. But first, let's just have a quick thought towards crop production. The stakes are high at the moment. We know that the input prices that we see are very high, but of course that's countered by the very high output values that we see. In that scenario, the worst case, of course, is to achieve a low yield, because you've had the high cost of production versus then a low output because of the yield. So we really do need to have yield center point to all of our management. Of course, when it comes to such high risk and the stakes being so high, then attention to detail is going to be ever more important, and nothing more so than when it comes to successfully establishing the oilseed crop. Really is critical to pay particular attention there to all of the decisions that you make for planning for success. And what I would say, and have said before, then it's very much a case of risk management versus risky management. And our whole aim should be to manage risk out of our production system rather than manage risk in when it comes to the agronomy decisions. So with those sort of background thoughts, then we'll hand over to Liam, who can take us through some of those key considerations when it comes to varietal choice and those early agronomic decisions for good establishment of the crop.
Thanks, Mark. I think the main focus of what I'm going to talk around is trait-focused oilseed rape breeding, and how those traits that we've brought into oilseed rape are sort of the fundamentals of what you should be looking at in terms of an IPM strategy on farm, the value of the traits and how they can be used in getting the best out of establishment of a crop. I think it's really important to look at how far we've come as an oilseed rape breeder. The first hybrids from ourselves were introduced in 2006, and since that point, really, we've seen a massive evolution in the technology we've been able to bring into oilseed rape market. And I think it's far greater than we've seen in any other arable species. So resistance to FOMA, resistance to pod shatter, club root resistance, TUIV resistance, and even looking forward through to nitrogen use efficiency now, which is going to be a key part going forwards. All of those have taken a lot of the risk out for growers in oilseed rape. Yes, we've seen massive pressures from clavage-stem flea beetle, but actually we're able to mitigate a lot of the other risks associated with growing oilseed rape. And actually variety selection from the start is the key focus for this. So as an LG, we are a European breeder. So unlike other breeders, our European crossing programme starts life in the UK, up in the Lincolnshire Wolds. And our breeding programme there is focused, as most breeding programs are, on yield potential. So without yield potential, variety choice is very easy. You need to be a high yielding variety now to get on the recommended list. The backbone and what underpins that yield potential for our breeders is how we secure that yield on farm. So it's not just about that high yielding varieties. There are a lot of high yielding varieties on the recommended list now. LG's focus is on sort of securing that yield on farm. So we've done that through resistance to TUIV, resistance to pod shatter, and Enflex as well. So we're looking at nitrogen use efficiency. So that's not necessarily nitrogen use efficiency, but it's mitigating yield loss at every single point. So that's not just looking at how much nitrogen is used, but disease resistance, pod shatter. There's the combination of all those traits to mean that yield loss is mitigated at every single opportunity. So I'll talk through the traits and sort of how they can help you as growers on farm. So TUIV is a virus, so turnip yellow virus. It's transmitted by Mysis persicae with infection in both the autumn and the spring. And any of you that grow oilseed rape will know that at the first sign of trouble, it tends to go purple. It gets too hot, it gets too cold, it gets too wet, it gets too dry, nitrogen hungry, it tends to go purple. And actually, that means that the symptoms are often misdiagnosed. The best way to describe TUIV is almost like long COVID. So the plant has this virus in the background. It's still able to form a plant. You will still get yield off there, so you'll not see crop loss, you'll not see yield loss, massive yield loss, but you will see yield reductions and oil reductions of up to 30%, which obviously with the commodity price at the minute is a massive sort of driving factor. So it is a resistance. There's a lot of talk at the minute about resistances and tolerances, and actually this resistance is a true resistance, so that does mitigate the need for controlling aphids in the autumn. Obviously direct feeding damage where you have highly colonized populations, you'll still look to control those, but in terms of virus protection for that crop and the surrounding crop, there is no need for that insecticide. So actually as a form of an IPM strategy, it takes some of that risk out of there as well. So we do monitor this. It's not just as breeders, we look at sort of where TUIV is across the UK. So we don't do this just as a marketing tool. We use it to monitor the effectiveness and ensure that the genetics are holding up, which they are. But actually what that means is that we get a fairly good idea of where TUIV is across the country. So last year we did some monitoring and 52% of the samples that we took contained TUIV. Highest infection in the southwest, as you would expect. But this ties in really nicely. I've looked across the data for the last 3 or 4 years, and actually that data ties in really nicely with Rothamsted and their aphid monitoring system. My predictions for this year, I think it'll be a high TUIV pressure year. So we've already seen that the neonic approval in sugar beet, so it's the same aphid in Mysis that causes virus yellows in sugar beet, causes TUIV in oilseed rape. So we haven't really had the weather to check those aphids, so my prediction really is that it'll be a high pressure autumn for TUIV, and the foundation of that is starting with the genetics, which isn't just our genetics. Most varieties at the top of the recommended list now have that resistance built in. Capricone flea beetle is obviously the elephant in the room when it comes to establishing a crop. I would love to sit here and say that we have genetic resistance. We don't. I think any breeder that says that they have varieties which are resistant or less likely is not true, really. I think there's a lot of work that needs to go into that. It's like anything, is if you say that if you do a trial, flea beetle or pests will always go for the easy option. We've seen it with pigeons, with certain varieties being less palatable to pigeons. That may be the case in trials, but as soon as you stick it in a field, it doesn't matter. They're hungry, they will go for it. So in terms of varietal sort of resistance to flea beetle, I don't think that any breeder, particularly ourselves, I would never stand here and say that. We can't say that we have that genetic resistance. There's obviously a big breeding target, and there's a lot of research going on, not just in the UK but across Europe, looking at that resistance, but we're not anywhere near in terms of commercialization of anything yet. What we have seen is that people have picked Vigour, so vigorous varieties has been sort of the driving factor for variety selection for the last 3 or 4 years, and that's sort of been the way to get through those risk periods. And I think it's really important to stress, particularly with the establishment, sort of the moisture in the soil at the moment, Vigour is not a get out of jail free card. In my mind, when you're looking to establish oilseed rape, it should be around soil moisture. That is the absolute key. So it's about soil moisture, it's about having the right nutrition there at drilling. Vigour does not get you out of jail. Vigour, what that does is it extends your sowing window. Oilseed rape will drill a lot later than what people think it was, and this year it's all about patience. So you're waiting for that soil moisture to be adequate. Oilseed rape, particularly the hybrids, will drill a lot later. Some of the best crops I've seen have been drilled into September. Most of the breeders' trials are not drilled into September as well. We've done a lot of work with ADAS and Yen. We know that plant population is 20 to 35. As you drill thicker, effectively you end up with thinner stems. So actually thinner stems they're more nitrogen hungry, they don't use as much nitrogen per plant. You end up with smaller, thinner plants which are more vulnerable to larval attack. And we've done a lot of work with this. We've done some work with Terra Nova over in France, and actually what we've noticed is that there are sort of two key stages which we need to get to. Good early vigour, so that's the speed to 3 to 4 leaves. And looking at the work in France, once we get a crop to 3 to 4 leaves, we can be fairly certain that actually that crop is safe from adult flea beetle damage. That means that the emphasis on is that early establishment. So that's looking at adequate soil moisture, adequate nutrition, getting that crop growing, but more importantly is keeping that crop growing. Once oilseed rape is established, it needs to keep growing. The worst thing that can happen is that you shit oilseed rape, you end up with cotyledons emerged, and then they stop growing. Oilseed rape takes very, very little to emerge. You can grow it on kitchen paper in your windowsill. It will chit and germinate overnight if you leave it in the right conditions. So the key is really keeping it growing once it has started. And then we're looking for that winter biomass. So the target should be 8 leaves with an 8mm collar. So that's just as the root is coming out of the ground, and then 15cm tap root. That is influenced by a lot of things. So obviously variety selection will help with that, but it's also drill timings, variety and nutrition as well. But plant populations has a huge influence on that. So the more space that you give an oilseed rape plant, the quicker and bigger it will get. We know that different varieties work differently. So this is just an example. So this is LG Averon, and we've seen that actually once you sow Averon, it keeps growing. It gets to that end goal very, very quickly. So if you're looking for something to grow across multiple with flexibility in a drilling window, you need those highly vigorous varieties. I think it's really important to mention that actually most of the crop losses come from larval damage as opposed to the adult damage. And actually, the thicker the stems you have, the thicker the petioles, larvae, those plants become more tolerant to larval damage. So you will end up with larvae in the petioles as opposed to the stems. It's where you get those thin plants with the thin stems. Carry stem flea beetle larvae will migrate into the stems, and that's where they cause major crop losses. Looking at disease, this is obviously a massive sort of driver for our program, and actually disease resistance it can start with varietal selection. 3 main diseases in the UK would be Phoma, light leaf spot, and verticillium. I think Phoma, there's a lot of talk about RLM7 breaking down at the minute from other breeders. I think actually what we've managed to do is we stack resistances. It's like what we do with wheat. We stack resistances in there. So if you look at the conventionals that we have, they've got good Phoma levels. We're then stacking RLM7 in combination with quantitative resistances, which is really good. We're not relying on RLM7 as a sole genetic resistance. Verticillium is very sporadic, but I think it's becoming more of an issue. It's obviously a target for our breeding program going forwards, but you need a lot of things to sort of align for that. Light leaf spot, I would say, is the most economically damaging in the UK now. It really is becoming like the yellow rust of oilseed rape. So we're seeing genetic mutations, we're seeing resistance to azoles. That is something that we can control with varietal resistance. So it's something important to bear in mind. Light leaf spot, I think it's just worth mentioning actually that what we're seeing now with climate change and in these milder autumns is we're seeing a greater progression of disease in the crop. Traditionally, what we've seen is those fawn lesions on the leaves in the autumn, and then that's when people are spraying. But what we're seeing now is that those spores are sporulating. We're seeing spread onto the stems and spread onto the pods without that winter to check the disease. And what we're seeing is actually there is differences in the stem-based symptoms and the foliar symptoms, which is very important. The cleaner stems we can get towards the end of the season is critical. When the season ends very quickly, like it has done this year, the cleaner the stem, the better nutrition supplies to the pod. So you end up with higher oil content, you'll end up with better yields. And this is some work that we've done. So we have a light leaf spot nursery in Scotland. Light leaf spot is not just a Scottish disease anymore. I think it's important to note it's endemic across France, Germany, and the whole of the UK. But what I've done here is I've got the RL scores on the top of the list, and the lower the bar, effectively the cleaner the stems are. So you can see that our varieties, Aurelio, Ambassador, Averon, yes, they've got those RL scores of 7. But you can see that they've got very clean stems when compared to other varieties which have RL scores of 7 as well. So there are different resistance mechanisms in place in those. And this isn't just the UK, we're seeing this across Europe as well. And this is just an image of that, really. So you can see that those two have the identical light leaf spot scores of 7s, but there's a massive difference in the stem cleanliness, which ultimately will impact yield and oil content from harvest. Finally, I think looking at traits, I think the traits is really important to mention is that these are genetic tools that you can include in your crop, and you have to be thinking towards the end of the season as well. I think pod shatter is the most important trait that we possess. When pod shatter is of value to you as a grower, actually you have spent as much as you are going to spend on that crop. So you've spent all your fertiliser, all your fungicide, all your seed costs, all your diesel, bar the diesel for the combine to harvest that. So actually, when this is an important tool, is at the end of the season, and it can mitigate a lot of yield loss. So what it does is it enables, it prevents natural seed dispersion, and it's a natural resistance trait that we've introduced through our hybridization system, and it reduces the risk of untimely pod shatter in commercial crops. So as you can see in the trials that we've done is that it's a very, very valuable trait. You've got those white crops there where the seed is shelled out compared to those darker brown crops where the seed is still intact. So reducing harvest losses, not just from hailstorms or adverse weather, but that repeated wetting and drying actually does a lot of damage to the crop, particularly in years like this where people are actually waiting for moisture in the crop. It makes those pods more resilient, and actually security around a late harvest further north you go. So just as a breeder, I think my opinion is that there is a lot of varieties on the recommended list. If you're looking to increase that maximum security in the variety choice that you make, the key for me would be to include those genetic traits. If you're looking for that combination of pod shatter and TUIV resistance, you really have reduced your variety selection quite dramatically. That's where we sit as breeders, and that's our target really, is to increase your genetic or reduce your risk as a grower through the genetics we provide. So thank you for listening. I'll pass you over to Natalie now.
Thanks, Liam. What I'm going to talk about is kind of how the nutrition plays a role in establishing oilseed rape, obviously once you've selected your variety. So if we think about establishment, then of course, you know, it starts with that seed itself. The seed needs to germinate, you know, and that happens once it comes into contact with water. And obviously Liam's mentioned, you know, that's a vital point of growing oilseed rape in the autumn, is making sure we've got that soil moisture, because without that, you know, we can't fill that seed, get it to swell, and, you know, start the germination process. And as well, we need a good seed soil contact as well for that process to start. But once we've got that, once the seed has accessed that water, the process activates an enzyme which will then start the seed actually growing itself. We know that the roots produced initially will scavenge for water and nutrients, and then that'll enable a shoot to start to be produced. But by having a seed treatment and coating the seed itself, that initial root won't have to go far. It will be having instant access basically to the nutrition that's on the seed treatment, and that's enabling it then to put more energy into growing more roots, starting the shoot, and then obviously establishing more quickly. And if we think about which nutrients are important, then we know that phosphate and manganese are important at this early growth stage. Phosphate we know is important for root and shoot development, and as well energy transfer, because all the processes within the plant require energy, so we need to make sure that we've got sufficient amounts of phosphate for all that to run efficiently. And manganese is important for chlorophyll production, and of course chlorophyll is linked directly to photosynthesis, so without that manganese, then it can interrupt the photosynthesis of the plant, and we don't want to interrupt anything at establishing oilseed rape. We do have a seed treatment. Glycerol MMP, as the name suggests, has got both manganese and phosphate in there, and we had some trials a couple of years ago now in Lincolnshire looking at some differences between the untreated and the treated, and these were some plant counts, as you can see, per metre squared. So you can see, yeah, we've got more than double the counts with the treated rather than the untreated there. So even though, you know, it's a very small thing, a seed treatment, you know, it makes a big difference. And if we look at the actual crop as well, you can see the untreated was a lot more patchy in establishment and slower to establish, whereas the treated plots were very even growth and yeah, establish much quicker and more evenly there. And if we look at some of the plants themselves, you can see there was quite a difference in the actual developmental stage as well, because it's been able to establish so much quicker with the addition of those key nutrients. And again, we've got the roots and shoot weights here per meter squared, and you can see there's a significant difference between the untreated, both roots and shoots, versus the blue treated, versus the treated levels there. So yeah, some really interesting results for that seed treatment. But what else can we do in terms of nutrition? Then of course, if you're in an MVZ, you've only got that 30 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare that you can apply to oilseed in the autumn. So do be aware of that. Obviously we can broadcast this, or it can be placed depending what equipment you've got available. We do have data to suggest that placement does have an advantage for oilseed, and plus we can also decrease the rate of nitrogen that you're going on at. So say instead of the 30, we could drop down to say 25, etc. So I've got some more data to show in a second, but this was looking at a trial that had broadcast versus place, and you can see there that we've got more even establishment with the placement of the fertilizer versus the broadcast there. So if we think about placement, you know, it's similar to the seed treatment idea really. You're placing the fertilizer below and to the side of where the seed is growing. So naturally the roots are going to develop and grow through where that fertilizer has been placed. And again, it won't have to expend much energy trying to access the nutrients, because they're, you know, it's literally growing straight through them. And that's particularly important for phosphate, which we know is immobile in the soil, so it can't move very much at all. So if the plant's able to access it as it grows down, you know, it's not had to expend much energy to find it. Phosphate, as we said earlier, you know, it's important for root and shoot development, and these are obviously key factors that we need at this early growth stage, because we're trying to get as many roots and shoots as we can to grow up and away from pests, etc. And again, energy transfer, you know, it's important for all processes within the plant, but especially during these kind of phases of rapid growth where we're going from something, you know, tiny seed to quite a sizable plant in only a few weeks of growth really. So therefore, you know, placing that fertilizer can give us that advantage to establishment speed, as well as you can see here the difference between the growth stages. These were taken on the same day. So if we look at these are the trials from those pictures. So you can see here we're looking at the fresh matter by variety placed versus broadcast. So the best practice is the placed, and then the standard practice is the broadcast. So you can see there's quite an increase in fresh matter between the various different varieties that we used here. So yeah, you can see it has made a big difference in this particular trial, and visually those differences stayed through to, you know, spring as well. However, you know, if you can't place fertilizer, it's not the end of the world. Broadcasting is still a good option. It's you know, it's vital that we get some fertilizer on that crop at, you know, as soon as you can really. So at drilling, or, you know, as soon as possible afterwards, just to give that crop the best start. I guess I just want to mention a little bit about the organo-mineral fertilizer that you might have heard us talk about in the past. We have a joint kind of initiative that we've got with Veolia, where we're trying to find a solution to the global food waste challenge, and less than 2% of food waste is actually collected and upcycled if we're looking at on a global scale there. So we're part of the Nutrient Upcycling Alliance that was established alongside the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and really what we're trying to do is promote the circular economy, which includes collecting food waste and potentially trying to turn that into fertilizer that will then go on to crops that will then return to the food and become waste again. So, you know, that's the idea behind the circular economy. So the products that we've got from this is Yara Nature. You can see the bag there. And there's some benefits that, you know, it's early days with this product, but we have seen some benefits already from organo-mineral fertilizers, and they've been demonstrated in papers, etc., such as improved nitrogen and nutrient use efficiency. And we know that these obviously have the organic fraction. So as the name suggests, it's a mixture of both organic material plus mineral fertilizer to make up the analysis. So having that organic matter in there, obviously we're trying to build the resilience in the soil. Again, we're talking about that soil moisture, that holding capacity, but as well, the organic matter helps with free draining soils as well. Another benefit over time, it will allow for reduced levels of P and K to be applied over rotation, and that's because you can hold a lot more nutrient on the organic matter fraction of the soil, and it becomes more available than potentially what's held onto the chemical fraction. So we all know that organic matter is important, so any way that we can try and build it is great. And of course we want to reduce inputs as well, not only for our pocket but also to increase that soil fertility. And again, it should have a lower carbon footprint as well, which will become ever more important as carbon footprints become key to all of our lives really. But yeah, certainly it will have a lower carbon footprint, and that's just due to the process. There's no fossil fuel involved as with mineral fertilizer. So if we look at Yara's OMF, as I mentioned, it does contain some mineral fertilizer in there as well. So therefore there is some immediately available nutrition through that fortification with ammonium sulfate. But it is a more sustainable solution because it has been made with recycled food and green waste, etc. And it is ideal as a starter fertilizer for oilseed, or you can have it obviously as a base dressing for spring cereals. But we have had some initial trials where we've looked at it on oilseed. These were last autumn. As I mentioned, this is a very new product, so we're still learning in terms of trial work, but you can see what we did here was look at it against some of our mineral fertilizer options. So we've got the Axan in there and 52S, and what we were really looking for was to make sure that it was comparable in terms of the efficacy of the product. And you can see there that we've got the same or even better results from these initial plant weights from last autumn's establishment. So yeah, some really encouraging first data that we've got off there, but of course we need to collect as much data as we can, which we are doing, and we're doing lots more trials this coming season. So if you're wondering what it looked like as well, that bottle that you can see there on the right hand side is the OMF product. And this is an 833 MPK product that you can see. It does look a bit different to what you might expect. It is a good product to start off with. It does have a high level of organic matter, so higher than 40% organic matter, which of course will build over time with repeated use. And you might not think from looking at it that it would spread very well, but we've got spreader testing results where the CV is less than 10% at over 32 meters, and I think even at plus 40 meters it's still 15%. So some really good encouraging results there from the spreader testing. And as I mentioned, some good results with yields comparable to mineral fertilizers. Our trials so far haven't gone to yield as I mentioned this at this point in time, but as soon as we've got the results, obviously we will share those as well. If you're looking just mineral fertilizer, then one of our best fits really for oilseed is Activa S. You can see the analysis there, 16, 15, 15. So yeah, ideal again for getting all the nutrients that crop requires at that point in time. And then if you are liquid, then something similar to that would be 1827 plus 0, including boron, because we know that boron is a key nutrient for oilseed, particularly in this establishment autumn phase. But I guess the most important point of all this is the timing. So I mentioned it earlier, it needs to be at drilling on the seedbed. We don't really want to have to wait until there's biomass there, because we've already potentially, stopped that momentum. Liam mentioned earlier, we don't want to stop that crop growing at all. So we need to ensure that we're keeping that momentum of growth going. So if it has germinated, we need to keep it growing as much as we can. So yeah, we don't want the nutrition to be the limiting factor to the establishment. As well, autumn micronutrients are important for oilseed establishment. It grows a lot in a short space of time, so it can quite easily deplete some of the available micronutrients from the soil. And of course, we've got our crop-specific product there, Breastroll Pro, which contains all the key nutrients for oilseed rape, and you can apply that in both the autumn and the spring. And this is some of our long-term trial work that you can see on this graph here. And the yield responses we're getting over those years, the average yield responses are 0.24 for a 2 litre application autumn and spring, or 0.29 for a 3 litre autumn and spring, which comes out on average at 0.27 tonnes per hectare, which with current prices, that's definitely worth the return on investment there for that application. So overall, I guess from a nutrition point of view, there's 3 phases that we can help with establishment. We've got the seed treatment, for when the crop is literally just starting out, to make sure we can get it established quickly. Then we can apply the NPK products, making sure we're not stopping that momentum once the seed has germinated, and then following that up before winter with some of the autumn micronutrients, which again will help the crop going into that winter phase. And then in the spring again, we can come through with another application there. So that's it from me. I'll hand over back now to Mark.
So thank you very much, Natalie and Liam, for some great information there to help growers with the decisions that they've got ahead of themselves. So yeah, some good information. Of course, if you want more information, then do make contact with us. You've also got, of course, the opportunity to go and visit the websites, lgseeds.co.uk, as Liam mentioned on his closing slide, for their website, but also then there's plenty of oilseed information at the yara.co.uk website. So really do just remember that it's risk management that we want to do, not risky management. And yes, that the words right at the beginning there of the webinar, which is fail to plan, and you are really planning to fail. So with that, thank you very much and goodbye.